And I was going to have you briefly introduce yourself, and then I was going to introduce myself too, if you want.
Okay, that'd be fine. Just tell me when.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you for joining me, Sal. I wanted to bring you back on so that we could just have a conversation about animal models, because you had talked about that in our debate when we had a debate about a week ago, Modern Day Debates. People can check it out there. And I wanted, just to have a conversation about some of the ideas that you have about animal models. I had a lot of thoughts. As someone who has worked with a whole variety of animal models, it's something that I definitely think about. And so, why don't we first kind of introduce each other? So, because I know you're also streaming on your channel too, right? So,
I will rebroadcast. I
oh,
know
you're
I'm
going to
going to have too
rebroadcast.
many
Great.
technical problems
I,
trying to
I,
live.
I had considered just
Okay.
recording and then rebroadcasting, but I was having a little hard time figuring it all out. So I figured, okay, I can at least just stream. So, and then it'll take care of itself. Yeah. So.
Well, I'm Salvador Cordova. I was a scientist and engineer in the aerospace and defense industry for at least 2 decades. And I had to take care of my widowed and disabled mother, and I stayed at home to take care of her. So it just so happened that I had to leave my career. A number of reasons for that, including just kind of my, I felt I was going nowhere in it, and I really wanted to be home to take care of my mother. I needed a job, and Dr. John C. Sanford, retired research Cornell professor, former atheist turned creationist, generously offered to let me work from home for him. I had no formal biology training when he hired me, and so I basically was a retread. I'm not really much into the debate scene or the high drama. There's a small clique of creationists who, like John Sanford, publish both in the secular world and also are popular in the creationist realm. And a lot of our work is not really well known. And that's just the way it is, because it's very nerdy and technical. I'm pleased to announce that through him and his colleagues, I've been able to publish in secular venues. Most of my work in the defense industry you'll never hear about for obvious reasons.
Sure.
So I can, you'll never see that reported on my curriculum vitae or anything. I don't have a PhD. I would like to go get a PhD. I do have 5 degrees, 3 undergrads and 2 masters. And I actually studied in Virginia Tech briefly, nice. Although I didn't graduate there. And so when you mentioned your affiliation with Virginia Tech, I was excited to hear that. I lived in East Danville, Johnston, once upon a time. The way they distribute the boys and girls in that dorm has changed. So if it sounds funny that I say I lived in East Danville, the guys used to be in the East and the girls in the West. So we have kind of a tie there, and I'm very fascinated by neuroscience. It's one of my favorite topics in biology, but I haven't had a chance to pursue it. And thank you for hosting this discussion.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to. So, and I tell you a little bit about just my background. So, I'm Chris Thompson. I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech in the School of Neuroscience. I am originally from Illinois. I grew up outside of Chicago, and I went to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, where I got my degree in ecology, ethology, and evolution. And there I worked with honeybees. So that was one set of animal models I've worked with, doing learning and memory experiments with honeybees. And at that time, I was fascinated with evolution. In fact, I worked in a paleontology lab as well for about a year, doing sorting a lot of their fossils and even doing fossil collection. But then I became more interested in the animal behavior part of my degree, which that's what ethology is. And with animal behavior, especially if you're interested in the evolution of animal behavior, you got to open up the black box, and that's the brain. So I ended up doing a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Washington in Seattle. And there I, working with Dr. Elliot Brenowitz, studied the seasonal changes that happen in the brain circuits that regulate singing behavior in songbirds. Super fascinating topic. I worked with a variety of animal models there. Did a number of contributed to various projects as well, even doing some work with rodents. And then after that, after I graduated, I worked at the Freie Universität in Berlin, Germany for 3 years, where I continued my songbird work. And there we were looking at FOXP2, which is kind of more known as the language gene in humans. But we were studying how it contributes to learning behavior in songbirds. And then after that, I switched to a whole new animal model, working with Holly Klein, who's a professor at the Scripps Research Institute in San Diego, where I was studying how thyroid hormone regulates brain circuits in developing Xenopus laevis tadpoles, which is the African clawed frog. So a whole nother animal model. So I've had a lot of experience with a variety of animal models, and I was intrigued by, some of what you were talking about with respect to animal models, that some of the common features that we find in animal models are the result of intention and planning by the designer. I think if that's a fair restating of what you were proposing.
It is partially.
Yeah.
If I could relate to some of my peer-reviewed work on this,
Sure.
it might give. So we can kind of philosophize and kind of just project our own ideas on things. And I was interested. The reason I felt justified in that is when we get to the molecular statistics, it's a lot more powerful, harder to run away from. That it looks like intention. So we have the nested hierarchy that in our debate, I said, we acknowledge it. A lot of creationists don't want to acknowledge that. I said, that's mistaken. It's just
hard
brutally
to not
evident.
Acknowledge it. Yes.
It's just brutally evident. And
right.
Just a little bit of my background as a theistic evolutionist, old earth creationist, young earth creationist. So it's not like I haven't seen some of this, but if I could share my screen here.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, please.
So
you should, I have you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, so this isn't the most carefully planned presentation, but let's see. I'll just share the screen here. So we talked about, if you could see where it says looking at problems of common descent, I said there's an independent protein orchard. On the left is a collagen, and then on the right is a human zinc finger. I argued that there's no common ancestry as far as a gene locus or even gene duplication. And that's kind of a well-known, quietly accepted fact. I don't get a lot of pushback from people that think about it, but we do have the thing of nested hierarchies. So for example, we would have a human collagen here and a zebrafish collagen there. It's about 75% similarity. And this is, if you take the homologs across species, you definitely will see a nested hierarchy. But what had happened is, and we don't know exactly who originated this. I think it's Nobel Prize winning stuff. And if we take these multiple sequence alignments and we do, I guess, the covariation at when we align these homologs and then we detect the covariations and pump it through this ugly looking math here. There's a Wikipedia entry on DCA. It's direct coupling analysis. When you pump it through there, you can generate a 3D model for the fold.
Sure.
And so it's a testable hypothesis whether, like, say, if we took the, so we would have homologs from the plants, homologs from all sorts of species. It's an open question that I want to work on someday. If we were to remove those data sets, would the full prediction fail? That would be a very interesting problem. And that's why So I'm putting that as a hypothesis. That is testable if the fold predictions will be terribly compromised the more that we remove these data sets. So therefore, that's where I'm hypothesizing if we have, okay, in an old Earth model, we'll just say, okay, that, the nested hierarchy is because of common descent. In a young Earth model, it's like, well, why do we have these patterns of similarity? And I said, well, this is kind of hard to run away from, subject to future experimental research. That if our fold predictions start to fail, it would seem to me that that was kind of like ordained for optimized for scientific discovery. So kind of the theme of optimized for scientific discovery. Some of the people that were the early pioneers of this were, as far as I know, were not against common descent, but they were sympathetic to ID. There are a lot of people in the direct coupling community that I know, whose names will not be revealed, that kind of share my sympathies about this. They're saying, yeah, I think that the way the creatures are designed is to actually, it looks like it's optimized to help us predict protein folds, which would also help us understand our own biology. So that's kind of at the very basal sense. And then regarding animals, please interrupt me. If you have,
no, go ahead. No, actually, go ahead with that point, because I'm curious to hear what you're about to say.
So that's where it came. I said, otherwise it's just going to be fluff and just kind of feel good theory. But that one is subject to statistics. It's an ongoing research project. Now, this is the diagram I did show in our debate. And I said, we can learn a little bit about ourselves, not just animals. For example, a lot of the advancement in understanding chromatin comes from the study of yeast, which I think is just amazing. Marshall Nierenberg was able to figure out the genetic code of humans by studying bacteria, which I find remarkable. And I left this one in for you. I emphasized it, the giant split axon.
I remember.
A lot of pioneering research in the 1940s during the middle of the World War. I should know the names of the researchers. I've since forgotten. That was very important. So kind of the
Hodgkin
policy.
and Huxley are the two who contributed to mostly to that.
Oh, thank you. So what had happened was, so some of this is just a matter of practicality. Sometimes it's nice to do organisms that have very high reproduction rates. It's also ethical issues, whether, it's not just practical, but ethical issues using humans as models, because that's the most accurate. This came to mind actually when I was taking a class with a neuroscientist at the NIH. Speaking of which, does the name Jeffrey Diamond ring any bells?
Jeffrey Diamond. It doesn't ring a bell.
He's a cellular neuroscientist. Anyway, he was my professor, and he assigned a class assignment. We're going to all do like term papers on each of the famous papers that advance neuroscience. And I was assigned a graduate student, not a graduate, I was a postdoctoral fellow. And our paper was on the tetrameric structure of glutamate receptors. And then I asked, it was by Rosamund. Rosamund's the tetrameric structure of glutamate receptors. And I asked the postdoctoral fellow, how do we get these cells? And he said they were human embryonic stem cells. And, there's definitely a lot of ethical questions floating around about that. And you can probably guess where my sympathies lie. It kind of made me very disturbed. But, stem cells aside, the issue of having to do kind of live, like say anything that would involve dissections, definitely a lot of people would almost universally have problems with that. And that's where I began to think these animals were providentially provided to kind of help us understand our own biology, but then we can take model organisms to actually understand other model organisms. So that's where all this, I think that's the most, I've had the opportunity now to actually talk through where I began with all this, but it really, the spark for it was Rosamund's paper, The Tetrameric Structure of Glutamate Receptors, and that little line about the HEK293 cell line, that really that's where some of this came from.
Okay. So, I've got some thoughts. So we can talk about like classic animal models. mice, rats, various monkeys, such as the macaque, has contributed enormously to our understanding of our biology, particularly function of the brain. Then you've mentioned chimpanzees. Um, the cat, of course, was featured very importantly in a lot of neuroscience. Work by Hubel and Weasel showing how the visual system works. A lot of that work was done in cats. Um, and then, of course, you can go farther afield, right? Such as Drosophila, the roundworm, other things that you mentioned, or even the squid. And during our debate, we talked about the squid. The reason why some of that work was initially done with squids is because they have these giant axons. That's what they're known as, having the giant axon. Now, the giant squid is a big organism. It has long axons that have to, control the tentacles and stuff. Um, and because cephalopods and no invertebrate has myelin, which is the sheathing that goes on the outside of axons to really enhance their conduction velocity, we have that in vertebrates, but we don't have that in invertebrates. Now, fortunately, that just leads to serendipitously in squids, the way they get around making sure they have good conduction velocity in their axons is that they just make the axon a lot bigger. So therefore, the action potential can go down the axon, about as fast as it can in vertebrates. But because it's so giant, back using technology that was available in the 1940s, it made it ideal for putting an electrode or a glass pipette onto the axon so that you can get nice isolated electrical recordings of these neurons. And then it was Hodgkin and Huxley that figured out, using the squid prep, of how do synapses work, what's vesicle release. It turns out that it's basically similar in vertebrates and in invertebrates. Of course, there are important differences too. So I guess my question is, so you feel that the giant squid was specifically designed to facilitate those discoveries for Hodgkin and Huxley? Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes. And then
But,
the reason I'm willing to say that is because of that the AlphaFold DCA coupling, direct coupling analysis. And again, I said that's a testable hypothesis, because if we start to pull off major groups from these constructions of these folding algorithms, and if it falls apart, it's like kind of hard. Okay, so short answer, yes. I would not have been as bold to say that if I didn't have, some connection to that field. So it's a testable hypothesis in that respect. Does that mean it's an ideal? It's as high fidelity a model as humans? Obviously not. So you raised a very interesting issue about the Parkin gene and the research that was millions of dollars that were wasted because the mouse didn't respond in the expected way. And I would say to that is that if there's no model that is as high fidelity as human, we're going to have these failures as a matter of principle. I mean, the highest fidelity model of the human apparatus is another human being. So what I postulated is, yes, it is each of these things are optimized. And we could, I'm not going to say, outside of the stuff of direct coupling analysis, I would just say this is more of a belief that is probably not directly testable. I put one that is testable, and then this one is more kind of an intuitive belief. And I think this is kind of the reason I put it on the table is I said, why don't we just assume we could either say we're similar because of common descent. If one is an old earth creationist, there's some common descent there, or we're similar because God optimized it to help us. And if we have any, I do believe there's some evidence the earth is young, it's not ready for prime time. But on that hypothesis, then we would be faced, well, what's the explanation for the similarity? And so that's how I derived it. Um, and that was really more for the creationists out there. They would accept that, and I would just put that as a faith hypothesis. And they could accept it just kind of like, because there's things in the Old Testament where animals were sacrificed to atone for sins,
Right.
and
Hmm.
that's healing for us.
Sure.
And so it would resonate with things that they would accept. I'm not putting it forward so much as a strong scientific hypothesis, rather than as much as what I'd call just kind of a nice operating principle to help us to do medical research. If we look at creatures as keys to understanding ourselves, that's another way of looking at biology.
Yeah, well, so I mean, okay, uh, as someone who accepts evolution as a viable working model, I also see animals as um, valuable tools for understanding the human condition, for understanding overall principles of biology, for medical discovery. I mean, so I think we both have the same sort of, I guess, value judgment of this of how animals can serve the role. Now,
Model
yeah,
organisms. Yeah.
but then
We're on the
I
same
would say
page
like
there.
the
Glad we can agree on
suitability of an
something.
animal model, some of it is just about what kind of questions you need to address. And then also it's just practical issues. So like, I'm going to bring up a slide if I can do that. Let's see if this actually works. All right. I don't know if you can see this.
I can see it.
Great. Okay.
It's kind of unfortunate sometimes you can't see what's on the Zoom screen. I can see it says mouse on the
Right.
left, rat on the right.
So I'm going to turn that off. Okay. So you can see this. So we got animal models, right? So this is a slide I show in one of my classes where I talk about unusual animal models, since I work with unusual animal models. And because most of the animals that are used in neuroscience typically are either mice or rats. So we have rodents as our choice. And yeah, this is just showing some of the differences between mice and rats. But part of the reason why we have settled on mice and rats are some of the reasons why we have picked all kinds of animal models. So, here's a list of some animal models. You mentioned the yeast and C. elegans, Drosophila, zebrafish. We have rodent models. We have iPSC derived neurons that we can measure in a dish. So, using pluripotent stem cell lines that are induced, we can even grow neurons in a dish. But of course, like I took this image off of Wikipedia, but it didn't include chicks, which I've done work with. It didn't include the other primates like chimpanzees, and it didn't include my favorite, which is the African clawed frog. Some of the reasons why we pick animal models are because of their similarity to humans, and obviously chimpanzees or macaques, they have high homology with humans. Genetically, they're very, very similar. Morphologically, they're very, very similar. And if you're working through an old Earth animal creationist model, which I suppose shares more similarity to the evolution model, then there's common descent, which would explain some of those things. Humans and chimpanzees have a lot of similarities because they share a common ancestor, although I don't believe all old Earth creationists believe that chimps and humans share a common ancestor. I know some do. Certainly theistic evolutionists do. But obviously young Earth creationists don't. They believe that chimps were specially designed, I guess, to facilitate animal research, so that we can discover things about humans. And the humans are obviously specially designed as well by a designer. But then things like rodents, part of the reason why we use rodents, they're not the animals that are most similar to humans. Like, okay, so I've got another slide in here I'm going to bring up. So this is another thing I stole off of Wikipedia. So this is taxonomy for rodents. We've got primates right here. And then, we start to look at where primates are relative to rodents. We have to go back about 90 million years, if you believe in genetic taxonomy, for the last common ancestor between humans and rodents. And that was before the dinosaurs were even killed off. So there's a fair amount of distance. But rodents are quite varied, right? We've got the lagomorphs, such as like the rabbits. You've got squirrels and dagoos and porcupines and guinea pigs, and then you have the chipmunks, beavers, and flying squirrels. They're all in one kind of group. And then you've got kangaroo rats and gophers, and then you get to the myomorpha, which, and this tree in Wikipedia shows just 6 species if we count them out. We got the rats and mice, and we got deer mice, birch mice, jumping mice, and pygmy mice. And the thing about the suborder myomorpha is that there's 1,524 different species of mouse-like rodents. And this, of all the species, if you count all the different mammalian species, the whales, the dolphins, the giraffes, the rhinoceroses, the different primates, a quarter of them are myomorpha, which includes gerbils, hamsters, lemmings, voles, rats, and mice. So I guess my question for you, I'll go back to my Zoom here. For research, though, we use the Norwegian rat primarily, and we use the house mouse, Mus musculus. The reason why we have settled on those is because they have they're species that have been next to humans for a very long time. It's called the house mouse because it became very accustomed to living with humans, so it's relatively easy to keep and maintain. And now we have domesticated lines of mice as well as rats, so they're even easier to keep in the lab. They're also cheap. They're not expensive. They're easy to keep in the lab. They're small, so therefore they don't take up that much space, and so the research costs are lower. So if I understand your contention, out of the 1,500 different species of rodents that are available, you're saying that a designer, or I presume you mean one designer, right? You're not talking about multiple designers, right? There's not like a rat designer and a mouse designer.
Correct.
There's a designer who designed well, first of all, how do you know that? How do you know there's not a rat designer and a mouse designer?
I'll give you kind of the inference that I put from the scientific standpoint. One of the slides I had in my debate and just got lost in the shuffle of everything.
Sure.
Was that I was pointing out the physicists have been also the ones putting out the God hypothesis, not one that's from religious doctrine, but they said, well, it seems to make sense. There's a conscious, intelligent being that created everything. So there's the 2005 Nature paper, Mental Universe, Richard Conhenry.
One being?
Yes.
How do you know that?
That was the subject of all their math. The Schrodinger equations would collapse. You need one observer to collapse the Schrodinger equations that spread out. So that's how it's kind of deep in their physics, and I wouldn't.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me because our only observations of consciousness are in beings who have brains.
I mean,
I could make someone unconscious by giving them anesthesia, then they are unconscious. Or I could eliminate their consciousness completely by removing the brain. You need a brain in order to have consciousness, right? Like plants don't have consciousness. And I would argue roundworms don't have consciousness because they don't really have like a fully formed brain with the circuits that we know are involved with consciousness, right? They don't have a default mode network, which is what neuroscientists believe is consciousness.
Well, what they had postulated, again, these are the physicists. I can read the quotes. I can grab them if you really want, if you're that deeply interested. I mean, this is a good time to do it. And that's where I would derive it from. I mean, if independent of philosophy, metaphysics, and theology, which I think is sometimes really not that helpful to questions about reality.
Sure.
These were derivations that were made by, one of them was an atheist. He's now a professing Christian, Frank Tipler, F.J. Belinfante, and then Richard Conhenry, who's still an agnostic, kind of atheist, but he's more like a deist. And he wrote the essay, Mental Universe. And then he'll list all the experiments and then all the quantum theory. Obviously, that there's no unified you asked how we knew, and I said there's no unified agreement among the physicists on such questions. I'm just putting it out there. So I'm just
Right.
offering it as a hypothesis, but the fact that we have this coordinated, okay, if the Earth is young, okay, under a young Earth hypothesis, if we're able to empirically show that it's young, and I didn't have a chance, I think, to put in the debate some of my thoughts on heavy electron
No,
quasi-particles and stuff, but
there was a
that's
lot of
another.
other talking happening. So
Yeah. So under that hypothesis is then why do we have all this? Why do we have all this design that's similar? It would just seem to me either you had multiple designers that agreed, or you had one designer, one mind that coordinated all. So I'm just putting that. I don't know that that is a falsifiable hypothesis whether
doesn't
it's
sound
one.
like it
It's
to
more of
me.
like a Cam's razor, the way that I would apply it, maybe not someone else.
Sure.
That would seem uh, the coincidences would at least look like coordination. We can either postulate multiple designers that somehow collaborated, or we could just invoke a single
Right.
designer. And then
Yeah.
because we go to physics that invokes a single designer under the hypothesis, the God hypothesis that was put forward, it was a single designer, and
Okay.
take it or
I don't know
leave it.
about that.
And that's how I would arrive at that. So these are questions that are, I don't think they can be resolved empirically. I don't know
Right.
that there is a experiment that can decide one way or the other. So
Hmm.
it's just an operating assumption.
Right. I guess I've been thinking about intelligent design for quite some time. When I lived in Seattle, that's the home of the Discovery Institute. So I would go to a lot of their presentations. That's part of the reason where my interest in this comes from, in this debate, that there's this, you know, uh, uh, a conflict. I don't know if that's really the right word. It's interesting that this exists at all, and that there's this kind of well-funded, organized group that makes up the minority position from many respects, but is able to get their message out in a very coordinated way. That's the way I kind of see that advocacy group. But the thing that I have a problem with intelligent design is that mostly you have Dembski's specified complexity, right? And then you have Behe's irreducible complexity, specified information, sorry, Dembski's specified information and Behe's irreducible complexity. Both of these are certainly, I would agree, can be seen as signatures of design, it seems, to some degree. However, I do feel like there can be naturalistic explanations for finding an irreducibly complex system, or finding specified information. You can have naturalistic explanations for those things and how they manifest themselves. And I think evolution, the model, has a pretty good way of that. But then I also find that intelligent design seems to stop there, and that's the thing that's frustrating to me, because we know a lot about intelligent design. Humans are intelligent designers. We also have animals, of course, that design intelligently in many ways, right? You look at what a honeybee is able to accomplish with the structure of its hive. It's pretty extraordinary. So if you see an empty hive and there's no organism there, you can be struck by certain features of it that would suggest that it was intelligently designed. And then if you analyze it further, well, then you can look for evidence of who did this, when did they do this, how many people did this. And so like those are the things that are about intelligent design that I feel like, okay, we're kind of missing the thing here. And if you want to look at, say, human, so when I look at like mice and rats, just going back to the animal models, was it one person or entity that made the mice and the rats, or and the squid, I guess, and roundworms? And so was there a factory someplace that these animals were made and put together? Like, because that's the thing that you would look for. Like if I found a car and there's certain things about it that I would say, oh, okay, this is intelligently designed. But then I can also look at information about, oh, Ford, and it says Detroit, and I can go to Detroit and I can look at the factory and I can talk to the people who put it together, and I can ask for their plans, and they have the designs out there. And then I find another car made by Chevy, and I can go, well, also to the Detroit, but fortunately I'm there already, so I can go over to the Chevy plant and see how they did it, and they have completely different designers who come up with different solutions to things. And so there we have multiple designers coming up with multiple solutions to the same thing. that seems to me a bit about how you might, if you were to look at the world as a whole and the way animals are organized, if they're designed, it seems crazy to me that it's just one person or thing or God, what did you say? A cosmic consciousness that's doing all of this. Especially given that when you look at animals, you have so many animals who fight with each other, if you know what I mean, right? You have animals that kill other animals. That's the, as Darwin said,
Seals.
nature, tooth and claw, right? And so the designer, if there's one designer, he's designing animals to kill each other. But to me, that makes it seem like, okay, if you look at the interactions of a cheetah and a gazelle, there's an optimization there where sometimes the gazelle gets away because they're very, very fast and they can outrun the cheetah, but sometimes they don't. And then the cheetah is able to catch a gazelle and have its dinner. To me, it almost seems like there must be two designers at the very least under those scenarios, because so it's a little bit like how you have the changes that occur. I think from your background, you'll appreciate this. You can look at the warfare systems that the United States makes, and you can look at warfare systems that Russia makes, and that there's this bouncing back and forth that occurs. And if you were to look at those systems in the US, you'd say, okay, yeah, they're designed. We can go to the plants and see where they were designed. We can find out when they were designed, how they were designed. But then we see these similar systems, but they're different in some ways. And of course, they have Cyrillic written on them. So therefore, it's a different language. And it says made in Moscow. And they're a completely different designer. And they're designed to destroy each other, right? Two designers at the very least.
I think you raise outstanding points, really
Sure.
this is a great discussion, by the way,
Great, I
because
appreciate it.
I have to say that these are the sort of discussions that I love engaging in and that are dismissed by other ID proponents and creationists. So
Yeah,
and it's kind of unfortunate because I know that when you raise these issues, there are other people like sitting in the pews of churches that have the same concerns. And I know it because I talk to them, and then
sure.
fundamentally because I've had the same questions myself. Now, we talked about sometimes for me, and I think there's been a little bit too much kind of absolutism when people say this is fact. It's like, well, no, it's not actually provable. It's more of a statement of faith. And I know that in mathematics, that there are things like we just accept that we can't
Sure.
actually prove. And it
Proofs.
ends
You
up
have
being,
proofs.
yeah, it ends up
Yep.
being just an accepted principle. And it really struck me about, the
Right.
question about the real number system. And it really, and so I try to make a distinction when I think something is just kind of my own reasonable operating principle versus what I think is maybe a hypothesis that can falsify. So there are claims we can make, and I try to be more careful than my colleagues about this. So while you were talking, if you saw me, I have another computer screen here. I
Sure.
did
No
want to
problem.
close, I wanted to close the loop on just some things,
Mhm.
since I appreciate your curiosity in this. There is, there's an essay in Nature, The Mental Universe,
Oh, okay.
July 6, 2005. He's a professor at my alma mater. This was not a research article, but he is articulating kind of the thought about God. He was not quite as explicit in it in the Nature essay, but in his other writings, he was, and it points to one deity. Again, it's not provable because there are physicists on the other side who would disagree, but I just, it was compelling to hear his reasons. And then the thing about consciousness, there's this book, The Quantum Enigma, that talks about consciousness being fundamental more so than matter. So the view is consciousness, both by Henry and these authors, that consciousness is more fundamental than atoms. And the idea is that there's this ultimate consciousness that is the foundation of everything. And by any description, that's God. And so they just kind of work this out. I know it just probably just, I know it can just make people shake their heads, but I'm pointing out
Yeah. I mean, for me,
these are not people coming from theological backgrounds.
right. because consciousness for me is,
Yeah,
I mean, to me that sounds like you're anthropomorphizing the universe, and but just punching through math down to levels to then where no one can understand what's actually being said, and then saying, oh well, this must be consciousness, and that doesn't
right.
make any sense to me whatsoever. I mean, consciousness is a manifestation of the activity of neural networks, and that when you fall asleep you lose your consciousness. When you're anesthetized, you lose your consciousness even more. But then we can regain that consciousness by activating brain circuits that we know are critical for overall consciousness. And then people who have damage to those areas, if it's sufficient enough, we call them vegetables, right? And unfortunately, there could be some brain function for certain things. They may have visual circuits that are still like seeing the world, but if say major aspects of the default mode network, which is a critical series of brain circuits that we think is pretty heavily involved in attention and consciousness, um, those things are necessary for having like consciousness. I mean, there's even certain kinds of strokes that will result in people who seemingly who were perfectly normal before the stroke, and then after the stroke they will have certain things that they can do that seem completely normal in some ways, like they can string words together with some sort of grammatical sense, but they will none of it will actually make sense. You listen to the content and it's referred to as word salad. So people with this kind of stroke, it's known as fluent aphasia. And so these people will just bring out just a bunch of words. It makes no sense whatsoever. I actually just covered this in a video that I put up yesterday, related to John Fetterman, who recently had a stroke. Right, he's running for Senate candidate, and there's some issues, the way it's being talked in the media. And I thought like we can talk about some interesting neuroscience there. For those individuals who like have a stroke in those comprehension areas, they're mostly now removed from the world in many ways. They cannot understand anything that is said to them, and they have no comprehension of it in any way of trying to reach out to them. There's zero comprehension on their part, and their ability to communicate with the rest of the world is completely hampered, despite the fact that they're mostly just talking. All right, that's kind of a long-winded way for me to say like that is our understanding of consciousness. You got to have a brain, and it's got to be a working brain. And if it's not there, I mean, how else? Like we don't see any other kind of consciousness. Now, that's not to say that it's impossible in other ways. I could imagine on other worlds with very different kinds of origins for life that there might be a completely different way of coming about with consciousness. But consciousness is that manifestation of the activity of neural networks. And I I mean, that's one of the reasons why I have a hard time with the intelligent design hypothesis, because I feel like it stops, and mostly it's an argument from incredulity. It says I don't believe that this thing could evolve because it's irreducibly complex, or this information is too specified to come about by natural mechanisms. Therefore, it must be designed. But okay, you can't stop there. What is the mechanism? How did it occur? When did it occur? Which I appreciate you actually wrestle with. And I know that you're actually very sincere about it. And that's why I like this conversation, this back and forth, because you are taking it seriously. You're not just trying to create some sort of parlor trick to poke holes. I mean, you're doing it a little bit. I'll give you that. And you're good at it. But but you at the same time, you also take it seriously, and you want to come up with like a real model of like how this works. But you're also, I don't know, I find you fascinating in some ways, because it feels like you're like, well, okay, I know this stuff doesn't make any sense with the world as I see it and as everyone else sees it. So this is what I guess you often refer to as like a faith statement. And so I'm just going to take it on faith that there was an entity, I guess we'll call him God or her God or whoever, that made the rats and the mice so that we could have animal models to study here at Virginia Tech, and we can put them in our vivariums and not have to pay a lot of money for them because they're cheap to keep. And it's not because they happen to evolve side by side with humans and they're just very small, like the 1,500 other rodents that we could pick. Anyway, I'm sorry to go on a little bit. I guess
Oh,
I'm
no,
ranting.
it's great to hear. The reason I pointed out the physicist is, me as a physics student, I'm a retread in, it's an engineer first and a physics student, then a biology
Sure.
student. But it really resonated to me to hear the physicists postulate and say there was a non-material, and this is because quantum mechanics, the future can affect the past. They're saying God exists at the end of time and he's controlling everything,
Yeah.
non-material. And you know, I just have a high respect for, I mean, it's hard for me to run away from that. And of course, given my personal metaphysical views, it kind of accorded with it. And if that's confirmation bias, so be it.
Sure.
But
I
I,
feel
you
like
know,
that's probably true to some
so
degree.
there are some things that I will say, and this is the difficulty. In science, we want something that we can explain and understand, therefore believe. We believe something, like I believe the light bulbs, like the light switch. I believe it exists and how it works because I understand I can control, I can experiment. The challenge is when we get to describing things that may be beyond our description. It might be true, but beyond our
Sure.
description. In mathematics, most numbers on the real line are non-computable. We cannot formally describe them, which is astonishing. And again, that echoes my feeling. It's like we're actually some physicists have pointed out and said we're actually very privileged to understand anything, because it's very easy. If the universe were structured differently, nothing would be comprehensible. And so even
Sure.
with
And if it
our
was, we
level of
wouldn't be here.
comprehensive, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
And if it was, we wouldn't be here.
And also the level of comprehensibility we have, and then the effectiveness of the scientific method, we're tempted to think, well, we could just extend to comprehend everything, which it's problematic with that. So there might be a lot of true statements about the universe and how things came to be that we will never comprehend or explain or describe mechanistically in our finite minds. And so I do understand why scientists would find the idea of a God we can't explain as revolting, because that means believing in something we'll never be able to explain or understand. Whereas someone who's done stuff with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle has seen some of the theorems in math that deal with incompleteness or just things we're postulating we'll definitely not understand as a matter of principle. It's like, well, I may not like it, but that's kind of the facts.
Sure.
There'll be things that are be outside. So for me,
I mean, so just kind of, all right. So, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on how you define your terms, right? Because you're saying God, and it's difficult to define something that's somewhat indefinable. Whereas when we talk about consciousness, we could come up with some sort of definition, at least, of what that is, and how it manifests itself. So I think that these things should be rooted in things so that we can see and touch for the most part. Touch either experimentally, and things that we can see experimentally using. So if it's quantal, we have devices that can get down to the quantum level. Now, of course, we can also come up with theories, and I would certainly be the first to concede that we have not worked out everything as far as consciousness goes. Absolutely, like we are still. It's the reason why neuroscience is such a hot growing field, because we're still learning a lot about how it actually works, and there's still a lot to learn and to know about it. I would be out of a job if we had solved the brain. So I'm kind of glad that we still have questions to answer. That said, it's okay, these things have to be rooted in physicality to some degree, and it's okay if it's not. If we don't know, it's okay to say we don't know, and therefore you're agnostic on it. And that's now a new avenue for approach. I suppose, and that's the thing that Arden kept saying in the debate is like, well, I'm not going to take a faith statement. He's right. It's like, well, sure, we're not going to take a leap of faith to just accept something, especially if it contradicts the things that we can see and touch, right? There are certain things and consequences of, say, Noah's flood that we should see if it actually happened the way that young Earth creationists posit that it occurred, and we don't. And I've gone out and touched these things and picked up fossils from an area that is classified as Ordovician, and all I find are Ordovician fossils. And if I go to just 20 miles, if you were here, you know that Christiansburg is just south of Blacksburg. There's Carboniferous fossils there. There's like a nice little park that has the old mine, the old coal mine that was there. And the whole reason why there's a coal mine there is because it was Carboniferous, and you can go and find fossils there. In fact, I know I did show and tell last time. I've still got some more show and tell to do. This is a seed of, I want to figure out what plant this came from, but I got this in Christiansburg. So this is some kind of seed of one of the Carboniferous type plants. And I was actually looking through my unfortunately this is fossils of Illinois, but Guide to Pennsylvanian fossil plants in Illinois that I got about 20 years ago, back when I lived in Illinois and I was doing fossil collecting there. It's not in here, unfortunately, but yeah, like, but I won't go to, you won't find this north of Blacksburg because those are Ordovician rocks. And so we reject that model that, okay, there was a flood that covered everywhere, including this area where I live, and it's impossible to find this sorting of fossils that would explain that, right? If it was all just flooded. Like, why can't you find marine mammal fossils in areas that have, Ordovician marine fossils, which are going to be mostly brachiopods or ammonites or things that we can only find sorted in those fossils that are from like 420 million years old. Anyway, I don't know. I don't want to get down that road because we're kind of getting off topic a little bit, but I am kind of, that's the thing about the model. Like, the model has to be consistent with the data, right? Like, there's a sorting of fossils that we can see that anyone can go out and collect. Encourage anyone, go out and get a fossil. You can do this on your own.
And I mean, really speaking of faith statements, and I know RN probably took exception when I said he had faith statements. I was saying that I didn't feel that and I'm actually in touch with two biologists. One of them's an evolutionary biologist. Another is Dr. Joel Duff, who is a theistic evolutionist. He's a professor of biology, has many PhD students. And he actually had a different view relative to RN about macroevolution and species. It's going to be interesting discussion. But I was saying, I felt it was a faith statement on his part that what he defined as the classes of macroevolution he was appealing to, I think they were insufficient to explain. And I credited Cindy Lincoln with saying that doesn't explain the origin of the major protein architectures. And I was trying to say, Aaron, that's a faith statement that it'll solve this problem, because I deal with some of this. And I'm just like, I can't say you could logically say that explains it. And I had a real problem with that. And I also had a problem, even though the debate was about evolution, you really see this in the area of abiogenesis. And to me, when I started, and Cindy mentioned it, I mean, we developed this together. I'm trying to teach her kind of my brand of creationism. That's why, if they asked her, it's like
school. Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to get her out of that. And she resisted that. We argued for 9 hours.
We all agree that, like, Hovind.
That was the best part of the debate.
Yeah. Everyone here agrees that Ken Hovind's terrible.
Let me tell you, I got backlash from some of the Hovind fans out there.
Oh, I'm sure. I don't know where his weird cult comes from, but there are people out there who somehow think that he's, the end all be all of creationism, and but most creationists don't see him that way. At least the ones who are, I mean, I take it more or less seriously and actually care about being accurate to some degree, right? So.
Well, part of the reason that there's a class of creationists like Dr. Sanford, Joe DeWeese. They're actually very good secular scientists, and Joe DeWeese he's been a co-author on some of my papers, works in cancer research. So I mean, you have really high ethical standards because you're dealing with people's lives, and so there's just a different way, mindset how we treat things. But just going back to RN, Cindy kept saying, how does that explain that diagram of the proteins? And I was just like, yeah, that's exactly the heart of where I was saying that I think that's, you can say it's a reasoned belief, but it's not like in the formal sense that he was able to make a solution for me. So for myself, I think it's well within science to say that something seems improbable given our understanding of natural laws. And so some origin of life researchers have proposed new laws of physics, and others later on, like Dean Kenyon, went on to believe in intelligent design, as ill-defined as what the mechanism might be.
Hmm.
I think it falls within science to say this is, our understanding of the Gibbs free energy, et cetera, and probability stuff that, and these are questions that came to me. It's like, I don't think I could resolve it. At what point do I personally, and this is just a rhetorical question, when I look at the structure of life, at what point will I give up and say, I think God did it? Or I could say it's a miracle. I could either appeal to like a highly improbable event, or I could appeal to new laws of physics, or I could appeal to God. I don't think that there's a testable hypothesis. I mean, there's not any way you can directly experimentally prove among the three, or you could just be agnostic, as you said. And
Sure.
that's kind of like a personal statement. So I can't
You
argue
know,
for the probability
sure.
and the chemistry. I'm not going to try to pretend that this is some formal proof God exists. And
And
as a kid,
I will certainly grant that like issues of abiogenesis, they're so I only my specialty focuses on things with brains, right? So we're talking obviously something very far away from where in the evolution model would suggest that we had single cell organisms for 3 billion years. So it's something I'm not super familiar with at all. And so I actually don't know the state of the field nearly as well as I would like to. I just don't have time to invest in it. Read a lot about it back in the day when I did, but I don't anymore. So
if I could ask, just so I could
Mhm.
understand, since you just said you focus on the brain, what classes do you actually teach?
So I contribute to several different kinds of classes. We actually have a class on brain and evolution, which is a great class. I'm looking to get involved with that class. I don't, and in fact, teach it. One of my colleagues does. But when I started to get, interested in debating online about this, I actually reached out to her about, hey, can I look at some of your materials and things? I teach a class on neuroplasticity, so how the brain changes in the face of certain environmental conditions or things that happen within the body. And then I also teach a class. Well, I teach Introduction to Neuroscience, Systems and Behavior. So my specialty is on, mostly about how cells grow and wire up in the brain, and I'm very much focused on circuits and how that they work. And so, like, I'm pretty well suited for teaching that introduction class. So I'm pretty familiar with, honestly, like the best way to learn about anything is teaching it. I learned about many different systems as a graduate student, but I didn't really memorize them very well. But once I started teaching these classes, I ended up my knowledge of the brain shot up quite a bit, because now I have to teach it. Um, and right, yeah.
Well, how we got there was you're talking about you didn't have as much time
Mhm.
to study the other topics like abiogen, and I totally get it. That's why I asked about your teaching. I'm just
Yeah,
like, I could understand. I mean, biology is such a broad field, and there are all
right.
these special. I could totally see that. So for me, partly as my personal journey and also part of my professional work, I had looked at some of these things from both the abiogenesis and then the eukaryotic
Hmm.
perspective, and lots
Yeah,
on genetic entropy, and then also protein origins. But then on
yeah.
some, yeah,
I don't want. We could revisit the genetic entropy argument. So I was basically unfamiliar with it before starting to learn a little bit about some of the things that you've brought up in debates, and I wasn't familiar with Sanford before, but I've read up a little bit about it. I don't want to spend time because I kind of need to get going in about 5 to 10 minutes,
well, if
but
you'd like to have another conversation
I
like this,
would, yes, because
and
I have some things about it that it's just like I feel like that this is a simplistic view and it's overlooking some certain things. But the to kind of wrap things back to the animal model part. I assume you believe that God created the 1,500 and some species of rodents, right? The hamsters, the gerbils, or do
I
you believe that because did they evolve to in the rapid evolution
It's a
sense
really
that?
good question, and I will deviate from some of my colleagues that are baraminologists. They obsess over things like that. In the
Mhm.
debate, I knew where Aaron was probably going to attack this, and I said, I believe that there are architectures where at least one member in that architecture is created. I can't speak for how they may have diversified.
Mhm.
Um, and so if we also include macroevolution to mean kind of the change in allele frequencies so that they'll be so different, you can call them a species.
Right.
Like, well, okay, that's not
Because
quite the
it
same
seems
thing as.
like most young Earth creationists accept evolution to some extent, as obviously do old Earth creationists, because I think part of the problem is that it's ludicrous to think that Noah had, you know, all 4,300 some species of mammals, all 9,700 species of birds, all 6,000 different species of frogs and amphibians. There's like 12,000 different species of reptiles, and you had to have two of every kind. And of course, for the clean animals, you had to have more than two. And then what do you do with like freshwater fish versus saltwater fish? And I know there's this whole thing, the creationists have come up with ideas about brackish water and that fish can accommodate, and that's not true, but they can't accommodate to that degree. Most of them can't. They can't just take a freshwater fish and put it in brackish water and then have it survive for very long. But then how do you feed all this stuff? We can go on and on about Noah's Ark and the problems with Noah's Ark, but that most young Earth creationists accept that, like, okay, fine, Noah had a finch, for instance, and then from that, the finches evolved relatively quickly. And so that's why we have zebra finch and Bengalese finch and other finches, right? House finch. And even though they look so different, and we find them in different groups in different continents as well. So it doesn't make a lot of sense as a model. But that's obviously macroevolution, because that's speciation. And you compare a Bengalese finch to a zebra finch, they're extraordinarily different in their song, in the way they look. And I've done a fair amount of work with zebra finches, so I know a fair amount about them. And so, yeah, and actually, let me share real quick with you, because this animal model thing about zebra finches. Let's see. So I'm going to share that. And so zebra finches are these guys right here. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can see it. So this is a male, this is a female. They're very cute. They make these fun little songs. I don't know if you can hear that. Hopefully you can. I'll play it again. And this is a sonogram, so we can observe what they sing. And they have to learn these songs, and they have a complex brain network that involves the perception and production of song. And that's what I spent a lot of my PhD on. Now, the zebrafinch comes from Australia.
Oh, Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I think you need to enable your sound so that I could hear the
Oh,
end of the song.
it's okay.
Okay.
I'll encourage people to check out the song if they can.
Okay.
It's a squeaky sound. And here, in fact, for your benefit, I will try to do my best of a zebrafinch song. It's a little squeaky. It's like that's what it sounds like. So I have colleagues who do much better zebrafinch songs than I do, but that's the best that I can do. So the thing about the zebrafinch is that they're sexually dimorphic. Just the male sings, which is interesting. Then it also manifests in the brain that the song system is much bigger in males than it is in females. They are domesticated, which obviously makes them pretty well suited for doing experiments in the lab. Therefore, they're widely used for research. The other thing is that they're opportunistic breeders. So if given food and water, they will breed. Now, we find them in this part of Australia, in the center. So this is their habitat range. And I assume you probably know what the center of Australia is like. It's a pretty inhospitable place. It's very hot. It's very dry. There's not a lot of food and water. Droughts are very normal experience there. So these are pretty tough little guys. And when they have food and water available, which can be very unpredictable, they will breed, and then they might breed again. So they're pretty quick with breeding. So we, and someone who believes that evolution is a working model would say, well, these animals are naturally selected to take advantage of when conditions allow, and will breed when they have food available. So they are quick to breed. So they're different than a lot of other finches, um, who breed seasonally, because in general food availability tends to be much more predictable in most areas of the world, but in the middle of Australia it's not. Um, that makes them really well suited for doing work in the lab, because you can get an adult zebrafinch within 90 days, and then you can start breeding it again. You don't have to wait a whole year to do more breeding. So therefore, they're really well suited for doing those kinds of experiments. So the thing is, it's like, all right, if these animals are specially created, so was it God who made the choice to put them in Australia so that they would, and then also design them to have this rapid breeding, opportunistic breeding strategy, um, and made them unique, like compared to the other finches? You see what I'm saying? Because like there's certain features that seem to correlate with, well, they're in terrible conditions, that only like the strategy is something that would serve a finch well. If a finch was going to be very strict on having to breed every year when conditions are not right, say in a particular March or whatever, then that finch is not going to be ready and not have babies that will survive, because it can't even feed them. But if a finch, there's going to be variability within a population. Some of that variability can be dictated by seasons, but some of it can kind of lose that ability. And then eventually it might settle on, well, actually the thing I'm going to focus mostly on is when food and water is available. And if it's available for longer than 3 months, then I can get another clutch in so I can breed again. You see what I'm saying? Like, so was it God who made that choice?
I would say yes, and I'll tell you how I would deduce that.
Yeah, how would you know that, and how can you test for that?
So again, appealing to physics, the fine-tuning of the universe would imply, and some of the numbers I've seen on this are astonishing, that even one electron in the wrong place, it's the equivalent of having one electron in the wrong place and then no universe. So even outside of any theology, it's like there's probably a lot of fine-tuning. So you've actually helped refine something I need to correct. This discussion has improved because you've asked such pointed questions. I'm like, I think Chris is right. So I said, if we just, I wouldn't say it's directly only solely, I shouldn't say it's solely for our benefit that they were created the way that they were in terms of model organisms to research. But the general idea is everything's created for a reason. Some of it is we can understand some of the reasons, but some we cannot. And I've said, like, the one that is testable is the one with the direct coupling analysis. As far as the distribution of the species around Australia, it's like I cannot reason that except to appeal to the fine-tuning arguments, where it looks like every electron had to be properly put in the universe. Whatever trajectory it ended up being in the way it unfolded today was necessary for our existence. So maybe this is just a consequence of the front loading, if someone believes in the front loading from the Big Bang, which I don't. But even on that assumption of old Earth, old universe, with every electron planned, it's like, well, however it plays out, it was necessary for our existence. We're just seeing it express itself now. So that would be my response to that. But you have
helped me refine. And part of what I meant to get at is that zebra finches are only one species of many finches, and not all of them are well suited for keeping in the lab, and they don't have this opportunistic breeding strategy. Some of them do, but most of them don't.
Well, I think you had a criticism, and I'm actually acknowledging that you're right. I have to read what I previously said.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is, like, did Noah have zebra finches on the ark, and then say Bengalese finches on the ark, and then house finches in the ark? Or was there a finch? Because, like, if this is specially created to promote discovery to help the human condition, and there are dozens and dozens of labs who have zebra finches. We have a lab here at Virginia Tech. It's filled with zebra finches.
I think you definitely identified the weakness in the way that I framed the problem and corrected it. So it was to my benefit to have spent this time with you, so I won't say that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to do that.
So there you go.
So
I could change
hopefully
my
we can
mind.
touch on it again. And I'd like to revisit the genetic entropy argument. Now, again, I'm not a geneticist. I do know a fair amount of just basic genetics, certainly more than your just average guy off the street. Um, um, and I'm curious to kind of get into it a little bit, because there's certain things about it that just is like, this seems like a very sort of reductionistic, simplistic view, and it's ignoring certain things about population genetics that are taught at the undergraduate level. But I might be missing something, and I'm kind of curious about that. And then also, I sent you an email like regarding that with ancient genomes, and I don't know how much Sanford has evaluated ancient genomes, because I assume the Nobel Prize this year went to Pablo Savant, what's his name? He's a Swedish guy who studied the Neanderthal genome,
Well,
and right.
it sounds like it's going to be a great show. We can address all that.
Yeah, because
So
like,
if you'd like to do this again next week, we can, same time, same place or something.
Maybe so it might need to be a little bit earlier, which is fine.
Okay.
That today I just was chock full, but I'll reach out to you and we'll figure it out.
Well, I want to thank you. You did.
Yeah.
You did. This is why it's good to interact. See, this is the one thing that I wish creationists would do more, have conversations like this.
Mm-hmm.
And don't be on the debate stage where you're just trying to humiliate your opponent, because we had a calm discussion like this,
right?
I could say, I think, Chris, you had a point, I was wrong. You don't do that on a debate stage. That's why I don't like debate.
Yeah, and I do like debate only in that, like, okay, as you pointed out, it's for show, it's to get a point across. But I also agree that for conversation purposes, it's pretty horrible. And you're not trying to convince the other side, you're putting on a show mostly. And so for that's the one reason why I think debate can serve a purpose, but it's largely artificial. This is a conversation and we're just kind of chatting, and we have very different perspectives, but I have enormous respect for you. You're you seem like a kind person, and you seem very intelligent, and you actually take these things seriously, and you're not just going to try to, like, yeah, like you said, kind of put people down or whatever. You're not that. You're the opposite of that, which I really appreciate. So that's part of the reason why.
Thank you for the kind words, and I think the same highly of you.
Sure. Well, thanks.
Someone has attained what you have done, to be a professor in this field.
I appreciate
great deal of respect.
Sure.
So I hope we will have continued conversation, and you've helped me. Mm-hmm. And so if your question was about some of the things I said, and to the extent they are incorrect, you actually pointed that out, and I'll have to rethink how I phrased the question.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And so I've gained something from this interaction.
Sure.
So thank you.
I appreciate that. No, thanks. I like talking about it. So I'll reach out again. We'll chat again. It might not be next week, but maybe 2 weeks from now. Anyway, we'll work it out. Okay.
Yes, I look forward to it. And thank you for all the, acquainting me with all these species and creatures. Like, I didn't know some of the names, like a Bengalese finch or
the Bengalese finch. Yes.
And all these other
there
creatures.
Are some labs who work with them. But the zebra finch is an amazing little bird.
Do you have them at Tech right now? Do you have any of these things at Tech?
Yeah, well, I don't work with them directly. There's a lab that I got a bit of a collaboration going on. We're looking at lead toxicity and how it impairs song learning in zebra finches. And we have some really interesting data. So yeah. So it's good for me to go back to the song bird work, which I've done a lot of work on and am pretty passionate about. So.
By the way, I really enjoyed your singing in bird. That was great.
I don't believe that for a second. No, you're just. I take everything I said back. No, nothing forthright about that. No, that's fine. Thank you. And I'll try to work out the audio thing as well. So next time, if we ever do talk about songbirds, I'm obviously going to have to be able to play a song, because that's the whole thing, right? So. All
right. Well, I'm going to leave the meeting, and thank you very much.
I got to run too. So good chatting with you. Take care.
Take care.